Yes, I think we are live.
Okay.
Yes.
Nanda, you want to share the slide?
Yes, I'll do that now.
I think we can begin.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is the final session of the Oral History Association of India's sixth annual conference, 2021, organized jointly with Flame University. And we're very excited to have this public talk with Jason Kelly, who's been leading the COVID-19 Oral History Project at Indiana University. Before we get into that, just a couple of notes. One about OHAI itself. The Oral History Association of India, OHAI, was founded in 2013, and it's committed to the value of oral history and provides a platform whereby those working with recording, interpreting, and archiving oral history can share their work, practices, and experiences in doing oral history. The annual conference that we are all part of right now is one such event that brings together practitioners exploring diverse facets of oral histories. Um, I will also now just go ahead and introduce the moderator and discussant for this particular session, Professor Maya Dodd. Maya is an assistant dean teaching, learning, and engagement, and an associate professor at Flame University, which is a partner organization for this particular annual conference. She completed her PhD from Stanford University and subsequent postdoctoral fellowships at CLGS JNU and with the Committee for South Asian Studies at Princeton University. She serves on the steering committee of Dharti, the Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovation, and her work is featured in Exploring Digital Humanities in India, Pedagogies, Practices, and Institutional Possibilities. She's guided a variety of student DH projects, including a couple that we've also heard from during this conference. Thanks so much, Maya. I should also add that she's been, thoroughly critical and integral to the process of this conference over the last few days. So, Maya, over to you, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Venkat. It is my delight to introduce you to Dr. Jason Kelly. Dr. Jason Kelly is, sorry, the director of the Indiana University Arts and Humanities Institute and an associate professor of British history in the School of Liberal Arts. He is also a visiting research fellow at Newcastle University and a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. Dr. Kelly received his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and as director now of the Indiana University Arts and Humanities Institute, Dr. Kelly supports Indiana's research mission by directing their grant programs, identifying and fostering transdisciplinary research collaborations, and organizing research workshops and symposia. He also acts as a liaison to the Indianapolis community, and in this capacity facilitates collaborative endeavors, including performances, lectures, and research projects. Dr. Kelly's research projects focus on the histories of the environment, human rights, and art. His current book project is A History of the Anthropocene, a deep history of human-nature relations. He leads a major international collaborative project, Rivers of the Anthropocene, which brings together scientists, humanists, and policymakers to study global river systems and policy since 1750. He directs the Cultural Ecologies Project, a public research program and PhD track that works with community stakeholders to examine cultural interventions across multiple scales. So we're really delighted actually to have the final session be a keynote by Dr. Kelly on the COVID-19 Oral History Project they've been working at. So over to you, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dodd. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation to speak at the Oral History Association of India. It's quite early here in the morning. It's 7 a.m. and it's evening in some places for the folks who are on this call. So good evening or good morning, depending on where you are in the world at the moment. So I've been asked to talk about the COVID-19 Oral History Project, which is a project that we started here at Indiana March 10th, so almost exactly a year ago at this point. So what I want to do today is introduce the COVID-19 Oral History Project, and I want to show how we've been developing it in collaboration with our partners, both here locally, but across the United States and across the globe as well. I want to provide some insight into some of the practical challenges that we've faced in the process of rolling this out and trying to implement it, as well as some of the opportunities that the program and the project has presented to us. And I also, and this will come towards the end of my talk today, but I'd like to introduce some of the theoretical concepts that we've been talking about when we were imagining how we both perform the oral histories and also interpret the oral histories. So let me share my screen with you right now. Okay. So the COVID-19 Oral History Project is part of a series of projects that we are working on here at the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute. And I quickly want to put it in the context of this so you can kind of see how it fits into the larger framework of what our institute work looks like. There are three major projects that we are running at the Institute right now. The first one being the Anthropocenes Network. And as part of the Anthropocenes Network, we have several sub-projects, one of which is the Rivers of the Anthropocene. But one that we're really focused on right now is called the Anthropocene Household. The Anthropocene household looks at the concept of the Anthropocene, which is this idea that humans have transformed the planet so much that we've effectively entered a new geological age. And we're taking that concept of the Anthropocene and to some extent kind of flipping it on its head, because when a lot of research, especially in the sciences, deals with the Anthropocene, it's looking at environmental change at the global level. In fact, the Anthropocene is very much a globally focused framework for talking about environmental change. The Anthropocene household is to imagine how the lived experience of the Anthropocene looks on the ground, and using the household as the framework for doing that. So we do things like work with our partners in the School of Science here to do lead testing of soil, dust, and water. We work with community partners to do educational forums, and a central piece of what we do is also oral histories related to that and getting a better understanding of how people are experiencing environmental transformation. Our second project is more ethnographic. This is cultural ecologies. We are very interested to see how arts and cultural interventions transform cities. And finally, the project I'm going to be talking about today, which is the COVID-19 Oral History Project. Now, the COVID-19 Oral History Project is a rapid response oral history project that's focused on archiving the lived experience of COVID-19. And we've designed it with two primary audiences in mind. On the one hand, we've designed it for professional researchers, as well as professional researchers in institutions, be they museums or universities, who want to work with primarily students to create new oral histories. And then our second audience are broader publics who might be interested in participating in that oral history project, in the oral history project itself. Now, all data that we're collecting in the oral history project is meant to be open access, it's meant to be open source, and it's meant to be shared with researchers and the public through both our library's archive as well as our partners, which is the Journal of the Plague Year COVID-19 archival project, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but that's based at Arizona State University. The data sets that we're collecting, we hope are going to do three things. So first, we're hoping that it creates a historical archive that provides a good representation of the various experiences of living through the COVID-19 pandemic. The second thing we hope that it does is it provides a tool for individuals and communities to come together and express their understandings, their hopes, their beliefs, and values throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and after. And then finally, we're hoping that it serves as a resource for policymakers, artists, activists, communities to interpret and respond to COVID-19 as a current pandemic, but also to plan for future pandemics. And what I'd like to do really quickly is walk you through the site itself, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the opportunity to participate both as a researcher or as a member of the broader public. So when folks arrive on the website, this is what they see, the COVID-19 Oral History Project, and they have the opportunity to get involved in two ways, as an interviewer or as an interviewee. So all they do is click on what they choose to be. And if somebody already has a significant amount of experience doing ethnographies or oral history, they follow one path and they fill out a form here. If they don't have any experience, but they wish they could participate in the project, we allow them to follow a second path, which is the path here. And this is a path to a bit of extra training for them. Folks can also upload their own stories. And by uploading my oral history, we're using oral history broadly here to allow people to share their narratives. This may not be with somebody who is interviewing them, but rather they might be narrating their stories directly into, let's say, their smartphone or their computer and uploading it into the database itself. So this is effectively the two routes for folks to enter material into the COVID-19 oral history database. And once it gets into the COVID-19 oral history database itself, then what we do is we make sure all of the metadata that folks have recorded looks good, and then we hand it over to the Journal of the Plague Year Project at Arizona State University, which is an OMECA-S framework for presenting the materials that we're collecting. So I'll talk a little bit about the Journal of the Plague Year in just a second, but what we will do in that project is then curate all of the oral histories that we've collected and present them to the public through that platform. So the history of the project itself. So the project emerged, like I said, about March 10th. On March 10th of last year, it was very clear that we were going to head off on spring break the following week, and we weren't going to return to campus afterwards. And we weren't sure how long that would be, but it was certainly going to transform our teaching for the year. And folks, of course, around the globe experienced this similar disruption in their semesters. And at the time, I was teaching a graduate course in digital public history. And we were, in fact, at that point about to enter the research phase of that course, where we were going to be doing social network analysis of literary texts. And I spoke to the students at roughly this moment last year and said, hey, look, we can continue doing the course the way we're doing it, and it will be great, but we're actually living through a historic moment. And as public historians, do we want to participate in that historic moment as public historians and transform our research project to focus on the current moment? And students unanimously in this class decided that they wanted to change the course that we were taking. And we effectively threw out the rest of the entire semester and decided to develop the COVID-19 Oral History Project as it exists today. So as we were doing that, as I was working out the frameworks of what this would look like and setting up the platforms for what this would look like, colleagues across the globe were developing their own projects, some of which were oral history projects, some of them were rapid response collecting projects, but there were these projects popping up around the globe. And one of the projects we reached out to very early on was the Journal of the Plague Year, a COVID-19 archive based at Arizona State University. And what we decided to do was, rather than recreate the wheel, we would pull the two projects together. And what we would do is the COVID-19 Oral History Project would collect oral histories and deposit them in the Journal of the Plague Year and present them on their interface. I would show you their interface right now, but since it is Sunday morning here, I believe it is down for maintenance at the moment, so you can't see it, but I'm sure you can find the link. But this, I believe, is the homepage. Well, this is what the homepage looks like here. So I'm going to walk you through it a little bit. It's quite similar to what the COVID-19 Oral History Project interface looked like. It allows folks to upload materials to the database, but those include other materials, not just oral histories, but if folks are collecting photos or they're collecting memes or they're writing diary entries, they can all deposit them into the Journal of the Plague Year project itself. Once it's uploaded, and quite often these objects are uploaded as part of course projects, and there's dozens of faculty and teachers across the country in the United States participating in this project. They are then curated by students and faculty who are associated with the Journal of the Plague Year project. And at present, a year after these projects were established, there's about 13,000 objects in the collection itself. Over 300 of those are oral histories. We have another, I want to say somewhere around 400 or 500 oral histories that are about to be deposited into this archive. So there's a pretty substantial amount of material being developed in this project. And the idea was, rather than having a decentralized set of smaller archives across the country, Journal of the Plague Year serves as a space to hold all of them. Anything that comes into the Journal of the Plague Year project that is either oral history or some form of audio or visual narrative, we effectively tag as an oral history, and it's the COVID-19 Oral History Project that is responsible for the curation of that in association with the Journal of the Plague Year team. In the process of developing these projects, of course, we've reached out to folks across the globe, and there's lots of different projects that are engaged with both the COVID-19 Oral History Project and the Journal of the Plague Year. And this brings up a lot of challenges, of course, because there's always the need to balance the central design of these projects with local needs. And so we're constantly working these ideas and projects out as a collaborative. And I think that's one of the strengths of these projects, is that they are in fact very collaborative, that anyone who wants to get involved in these projects can participate and help develop them in the directions that they're headed. But even when we really want to work together, even when we really want to map projects onto each other, even when we have the exact same vision, of course, things can get in the way. And I'm sure any of us who've worked on collaborative projects have experienced this in one way or another. I'm just going to point out one that we had recently in the last, 7 months or so, which is the Irish COVID-19 Oral History Project. From the beginning, our idea was to work hand in hand with the Irish COVID-19 Oral History Project to develop these projects together and perhaps even share the same platform. But because Ireland is in the EU, they had different privacy regulations for storage of the data. Their university had different IRB regulations and expectations. And since we were storing our material using Google servers, this became yet another problem in us being able to work together. So what we found early on was that for this particular project, we would just simply have to operate side by side, even though the projects are effectively mirror images of each other. It's just because of the nation state framework and the limits of international cooperation that are imposed by different legal mechanisms, we weren't able to join up the projects together. But there's a lot of sharing nonetheless that's happening through design and conversation with projects in different places around the globe. Now, that's only one of the problems that are associated with doing these types of projects right now. I'm going to stop my share right here so I can talk to you directly, because otherwise you'd just be looking at that slide for a little bit. But we're very keen on focusing in on these challenges, and these challenges are emergent as we're designing and working on the COVID-19 Oral History Project, the Journal of the Plague Year. We've experienced different challenges. The number one challenge, and we knew this was going to be a problem starting off, was that the very nature of archives are such that they tend to reproduce power and they create silences. And so we were very concerned with who was participating in these projects, what silences was our work going to create. So for example, if we ask people to upload their own stories without any guidance, what kinds of stories were going to find their way into the archive? We didn't know the answer to that, but that was a serious question for us. The questions of race and ethnicity, the questions of class, the questions of gender and more, and recognizing that these categories are they're non-stable, unstable objects, that they change with time and they change as they operate across the globe, are important problems that we have had to deal with. That I already mentioned the passive nature of self-uploading. How do we deal with that? So we've come up with several solutions to these types of questions. So the Journal of the Plague Year, for example, has been active in creating what they are calling calls. And so they recruit participants by focusing on silences in the archives, and they ask people specifically to target various silences that are developing in the archive. So that's been a very positive and active way to deal with the ways that archives can often reproduce silence and power. In the classroom, we've also noticed that this can be particularly challenging. We've taken a couple of approaches to dealing with the ways that the archives tend to reproduce the demographics of our student bodies. And so, for example, one way to deal with this is to, and different projects have done this that are engaged with our projects, is to embed students in ongoing projects that are already working with community organizations or community groups, and having students work with them allows the students to reach out to folks they may not have known going into the classroom. And if those ongoing projects are dealing with diverse communities, then our oral histories are going to be more diverse. The second solution that we've come up in the classroom format is to have our students write reflective papers to express how they're actually going about addressing silences in the archive. So rather than being too directive about who students interview or making a call for students to interview to address a silence in the archive, just the process of asking students to think about, to reflect, to understand what they're doing and how they're doing it in the archival context has been quite helpful as well. Another key challenge in the context of this form of collecting has been concerns over what people are sharing. So for example, are they sharing private health information? Are they sharing identifiable information that could be potentially problematic? So for example, if oral historians are working with undocumented immigrants, the question of anonymity becomes a very important one. And so we've actually created a whole workflow for folks who might need to create anonymous oral histories. And there's a process that people need to work through, and actually a separate informed consent document that deals with the process of anonymous interviews. Because this is a crowdsourced model of oral history collecting, and we're dealing with people at different knowledge levels and experience levels, there can be a divergence in quality of the oral histories as well. So we've been active in creating training modules for our students and for the public at large. And these include two different forms of training. We are doing Zoom trainings, in-person trainings, and then these are supplemented by online training modules that we've created. So I'm going to share my screen again with you in just a second, and you can see what one of these training modules looks like. So this is the COVID-19 Oral History Training Project module. And when somebody arrives at the training module, they'll get an introduction to what the Oral History Project is all about, what the course modules are all about, and how to move through the project itself. So they would just start on the first page here and just work their way through the various modules that we have available for them. And so there's a module that's focused on about oral histories, how to record oral histories, the pre-interview process, the interview process, how to process the interviews, which includes how to transcribe and how to add metadata to everything. So it's a relatively short set of modules, but it can be quite useful for folks who are new to oral history, and especially for teachers who'd like to integrate oral history into the classroom itself. Now, when we're talking about the process of working with multiple groups and the challenges that come with working with groups across the globe, is the process of standardizing the collection of data. So one of the areas, for example, is making sure that the interface is user-friendly enough that folks who are uploading their own stories aren't put off. They're not asked for too much information that might cause them to just simply not upload the recording itself. So the both projects, the COVID-19 Oral History Project and the Journal of the Plague Year projects, have tried to find this balance between trying to capture as much metadata as possible and this user-friendly interface. So Journal of the Plague Year has a simpler interface than the COVID-19 Oral History Project. And so what we tend to do is we send folks who are new to doing oral histories to the Journal of the Plague Year Project to upload their materials there. But folks who've been through our training sessions, who've worked through all the modules, we encourage them to upload to the COVID-19 Oral History website, which asks for a more complete set of metadata. Now, what the metadata looks like is also a complication that has emerged from the process of collaboratively working through this material. So we allow users to create their own tags, and these will be the framework through which all of the different materials are sorted in the database. The question has emerged, and this is an ongoing question that we discuss constantly, which is, to what extent does or should the archivist shape the interpretation of the materials that have been uploaded? So for example, if somebody is uploading a piece of data or an oral history that is full of misinformation about COVID-19, what is the archivist's responsibility? We all know that archives are not neutral. Archivists are not neutral. So to what extent should the archivist be involved in the interpretive process through labeling things conspiracy or labeling things misinformation, or providing context for future readers, basically a reading of an oral history or a reading of an image that gets uploaded to the database? So again, these are all questions that have emerged in the process of doing this work, which is very useful, and it allows us to think and I think create a much better archive overall. One of the things that comes up fairly regularly in our conversations about this rapid response oral history project is, when is the rapid response piece of it over? When is COVID-19 done? What is the timeline of the project? And this question itself brings up an important question that maybe is sometimes forgotten when we're doing these projects, which is, what exactly are we talking about even when we talk about COVID-19? So we have this COVID-19 oral history project. Are we simply focused on COVID-19 and the disease, the pandemic, as it affects our communities? Or are we seeing COVID-19 in a broader context? Are we asking our oral histories to do work that goes beyond simply understanding the individual's experience of the COVID-19 pandemic? And so one of the frameworks that I am particularly keen that we focus on is understanding COVID-19 not simply as a virus. Rather than thinking of COVID-19 simply as a biological entity, just this thing that enters our bodies, gets us sick, that we exchange with other people in our networks, but rather that that's almost a too limited way to see COVID-19. That in fact, COVID-19 is not just a biophysical entity, but it's a sociocultural entity as well. And in fact, it's this entanglement between the biophysical and the sociocultural that defines the COVID-19 pandemic. And so this is maybe a theoretical framework for thinking about the COVID-19 Oral History Project, and I think has quite a bit of relevance for how the projects and projects like this move forward. And so what I'd like to do is switch over to a diagram that talks a little bit more explicitly about what I mean by COVID-19 being an entanglement between a sociocultural entity and a biophysical entity. So if we think about the ways that COVID-19 has emerged, it actually emerges, I would argue, from the Anthropocene condition. And you can see here the projects are kind of talking to each other at this point. The Anthropocene condition, meaning the condition of global capitalism, of global commerce, of hyper engagement transportation networks, through deforestation, through urbanization, through concentration of populations. COVID-19 as a virus could effectively have emerged at any time, but COVID-19 emerged in the conditions of the Anthropocene, one that is characterized by these global networks, by people coming together in large groups. And so I put this chart together, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing with you, but I'll make it available. COVID-19 as a zoonotic disease means that it's jumping from some other species over to humans. And of course, this happened in Wuhan. And it is possible, and we won't know this for, I'm sure, years until scientists do all the research, but we know that zoonotic diseases emerge from conditions, or quite often emerge from conditions of environmental degradation, deforestation, habitat degradation, climate change, threats to biodiversity. And it's possible that these conditions, these Anthropocene conditions, made the COVID-19 outbreak possible. But it's only through those pre-existing sociocultural conditions that it was able to do the work that it's done in the world. So for example, it's not just the jump from animal to human, but it's the jump that's allowed through global commerce, through global transportation networks that are connecting urban populations. And it's that causes the outbreak. And when we have the outbreak, then that is when it sits in these sociocultural systems, when it sits in these economic systems and political systems that are grounded in long histories, that are grounded in relations of power. And it's here where I think the COVID-19 Oral History projects and projects like it are able to help us learn something bigger about the pandemic itself. It's not just how the virus is exchanged between humans, but rather how humans respond to the virus itself. And again, knowledges, ethics, ideas about trust, everyday practices, our welfare systems, our public health systems, how wealth is distributed, the conditions of equality or inequality, the nature of diplomacy, all of these shape how the virus is able to function in the world itself. And on the flip side, those same entities, those same systems, the sociocultural systems, the economic systems, and the political systems are in turn transformed by the pandemic. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about COVID-19 being a biophysical sociocultural entanglement. These two things are tied together. One allows the conditions to emerge, the other transform those very conditions. It's through that entanglement that the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a pandemic of more than just disease, but it's a pandemic that affects all of these systems. That is what I would argue oral historians and historians broadly need to pay attention to. And so in thinking about this in the context of oral history and bringing us back to oral history itself, it makes us wonder, what is it that is COVID-19, and when does COVID-19 come to an end? As a general condition, we've been working from the premise that the COVID-19 Oral History Project is going to last for at least a decade, because certainly the economic, political, and sociocultural effects of COVID-19 will last for at least a decade. And that's that historical process that I think oral histories can help us understand. Now, moving away from this kind of more theoretical perspective on things, our project right now is now looking more closely at not just the experience of the pandemic, but trying to focus on the sociocultural experiences and the contexts in which that pandemic is happening. So, you know, this year in the United States, for example, the pandemic is much more than just a pandemic, that so many other things have been wrapped up in this pandemic. Obviously, the political controversies, the insurrection that the United States experienced in early January, these are not separate from this pandemic context. The anti-science language, the anti-masking language, the arguments over rights, these are tied up in the pandemic itself, and they're shaping our public health responses to it. Another pandemic that has been happening at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic is, of course, the pandemic of racial violence here in the United States. And so right now, the COVID-19 Oral History Project has turned much of its attention to looking at the intersection between Black Lives Matter protests and COVID-19. And we're especially focused right now at actually the local level. We've turned a lot of our attention here to one city, the city of Indianapolis, and we're currently developing an exhibition that merges oral history with multimodal presentations. So object histories and videos and artworks that were created during the protests over the past summer, combining together with these narratives, which we are then developing in collaboration with community curators. So this isn't a project that's just being done by a university, but it's a project being done with community curators to tell the story of the varied experiences of communities across Indianapolis who've experienced those twin pandemics of racial violence and the COVID-19 pandemic. A second thing I would argue that we're quite focused on at the moment with the COVID-19 Oral History Project is the question of oral history as pedagogy. So we're working with partners in both Arizona, as you know, but also colleagues in Germany to develop a series of programs that are focused on exhibitions and archiving and multimodal narration that tell the story of COVID-19. And in the process of doing this, we are constantly creating and regularly producing new training materials and new training modules that we're sharing publicly, both among the network of individuals and universities and museums that are working on this project, but also with the broader publics who would like to use those materials in their own collaborations. And in order to make this happen, our university has actually funded a new lab, which we're calling the new Humanities Lab at the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute, which puts undergraduate students in conversation with graduate students and embeds them in this COVID-19 oral history project, which is funded for the next 2 years to have students participate in this high impact learning process of on the ground research with community members and specifically focused on oral histories. Our partners in Germany, specifically at the University of Hamburg, have created a similar project to the Journal of the Plague Year project called the Corona Archive. And we're actually team teaching our digital history courses now so that our students are not just doing work locally, but they're actually doing comparative work on COVID-19, as well as the history of pandemics, in this case, in Northern Germany and in Indiana over the last 200 years. So we're being able to work with students to put COVID-19 in the context of tuberculosis and cholera outbreaks and influenza, for example, so that we can train students in that historical framework, we can train them in oral histories, and we can train them in comparative work that crosses national boundaries. And finally, what the project is particularly going to be focused on over the next year is expanding our community engagement through training folks outside higher education to be both curators and oral historians as part of the project. And I think this truly is one of the best features of the COVID-19 Oral History Project and the Journal of the Plague Year, in that it allows individuals, no matter what their background, to work together as community partners in this digital environment to create this archive that is going to be one of the important records of COVID-19 and hopefully will be one of the essential sources for not just historians, but public health officials and policymakers as they decide how to respond to the next pandemic. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and finish my presentation and welcome any questions that you might have.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Jason. That was so comprehensive and so inspiring. I think all of us in universities around the world are grappling with, this contemporary challenge, and we want to be relevant, right? Whatever we do in terms of our teaching, and we don't know what world we're letting our students out into either. So in every sense, I think you've really, for us, hit all the points, that could be considered. We have a few questions in the chat box, so I'll begin with, I think it's Eliza. Eliza, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hi, thank you. So glad to be in the same time zone, Jason. So it was really, really very interesting talk. And we've all been trying to use oral history in our courses, and interesting to see that you have this project where we could all participate in. My question goes in this idea of doing oral history of the present, that I think it's such a complicated thing, but interesting to think forward as well in creating an archive of these experiences. And so my questions goes on how you understand this idea of oral histories in the present, but also how to contextualize them, to make them, to take them out of this idea of that it's only a disruption of normality, and to see all these root causes and this idea of a historical process that you can see through history, but sometimes when you're experiencing these things, it looks like something exceptional, and so guilt and all these other cultural aspects of why this is happening to me. So how can you contextualize these in history? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a fantastic question. It's a question that I don't think any of us maybe have the answer to, but it's definitely something that we grapple with. When we started this project, the question of can we do an oral history of the present was there from the very beginning. But then, that was a concern of mine. But then I started thinking back to the histories that we've seen over millennia, right? So, my mind went to Thucydides and his story of the plague outbreak in Athens. That's the first place my mind went to with this. I guess that kind of answers the second part of your question, which is how do we see this as not exceptional? We see it in the larger context. But my brain went immediately to Thucydides, to some extent being on the ground in the moment, experiencing this and writing this down. And as you look through historians across continents, across histories, you see them recording things like this, the history of the present. To me, I'm a scholar of the 18th century. That's where my research is. And so it seemed very strange to me to some extent to be doing this oral history of the present. But at the same time, it seemed absolutely necessary as a historian, as a publicly engaged historian, that we had to do something. And historians do something, and that is they observe and they interpret. And so none of us could, as historians, solve the various crises that we were facing, but we could do the thing that we did well, that we know that society will either use now or later, and that is observe and interpret. Now, can we interpret it? That's a broader question and a bigger question, and I think that's why I think it's so important to have these longer term frameworks for it. So in trying to not recognize, it is an exceptional moment of a sort, but it's not exceptional in the experience of humanity, right? Generations after generations have experienced pandemics and the trauma that comes with these pandemics. And so I think putting them in that historical context is absolutely, at least for students, is the way to help them begin to recognize where that sits. I think that chart I showed you is also a really important thing, because the virus can seem exceptional in the modern world, which is so scientific, right? So the news reports, the presentations tend to deal with the virus as a biological entity that must be controlled in some way, and that all of these other things that are happening in the world are kind of epiphenomena of the virus itself. And so I think this is where history does a really great job of being able to see those ties and those networks and frame it in that historical perspective, and bring together that history of biology and the history of science and the history of a virus together with the histories of power, economics, and politics. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that is at least the lens through which I'm looking at the question.
That's great, Jason. Yeah, thank you. Can I just add to that question, Eliza, if it's okay? Siobhan, I see you're sort of also writing something in the box, in the chat box. But so the thing was, this book came out recently in India called Age of Pandemics, and it actually sort of was astounded by the fact that there had been such little writing about the 1918 Spanish flu that also killed 20 million Indians. So as an event, it was, sort of as great a magnitude as possible. Now, when it comes to historical events, obviously, there is the archival deficit, right, that we're trying to redress all the time. But when it comes to the present day, YouTube's slogan was broadcast yourself, right? So we live in a time when, in a sense, everybody is in this business of sort of cataloging the right now for themselves, maybe in ways that are very messy, but the amount of data generated by this kind of endless cataloging. So at what point can the university sort of setting or something function as the curator of that content versus the wonderful idea that the projects you mentioned push out, which are community curators, right? So the individual sort of censor and the community censor function that actually all scholarship performs, right? Which is this idea of filtering and, as you mentioned, right, interpreting actually. What is the distinction really between the academic sort of curation of this versus popular?
Such a good question. So many answers. The first thing that comes to mind when I think of something like YouTube, and this is a very practical thing, but I think a necessary thing for, I think, our academic community to think about, which is, even if we didn't collect, there would be all of this information, as you say, available, right? People's stories are out there, but those stories are proprietary. They're owned by a private corporation, which is, without saying anything about whether that's good or bad, that is problematic from from that perspective. I'd also say that when I think of the curator and the community curators and what role the universities can play in this, and I hope we can do this, because it's so hard for universities to do what I'm about to say, which is that for a project like this, for COVID-19, this must be knowledges in dialogue with each other. That is the only way I would argue for this to be an effective process. If it is just the university collecting and interpreting and putting it out there, that is a valuable thing in and of itself, but it's also limited and it's limiting. But when we are putting the various knowledges, and that's why the chart that I put up and had knowledges and different ways to knowledge, it wasn't comprehensive, but it's about making those dialogues happen. Right. Community dialogues around these things, even national dialogues around these questions. I think that's when the university can step beyond its role of telling and into a world of participating and listening as well. And I think that's where new knowledges are going to emerge.
No, couldn't agree with you more. So that's why we're so thrilled to be collaborating with the Oral History Association of India. In many ways, these intersections have not been very frequent, but I think it's high time. Siobhan, would you like to unmute yourself for your question?
Sure. Yeah, Jason, I think you did already cover some of this, but I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how we can best acknowledge or respond to the potential of a lack of representation and inclusivity of experience when we're working from a position of university-led crowdsourcing project. And I think you talked about the importance of partnerships with civil society organizations who might be better connected to different groups. But yeah, I think we have to repeatedly acknowledge that in terms of that sort of restricted positionality, if you like.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan. Yeah, so I think this is where there's both the strength, as you notice, and the weakness and the strength of the university. So when I think of the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute, our mission is actually to be embedded in the community. And so going into this, we've been around for 9 years. So we've developed networks, we've developed systems of trust and relationships with folks. And so for a university to do this ethically and responsibly, I would argue that they have to make a long-term commitment to it. So it's not just about filling silences, but it's about the university working in the communities that it knows and having a long-term commitment so that those silences are more likely to be represented in the archive. From a more practical standpoint, and the universities are always, by the nature of the institution itself, it's always going to leave out stories, and that's where the community partnerships are so important. But I think one thing that the university does quite well and could do well in its methodological frameworks for oral history is to embed a reflexive framework as well as a critical framework in the methods itself. So for example, have a process embedded such that maybe your graduate students are using what they're learning in their theory courses to actually critique the project, embedding a critical theorist in the project to critique the project itself, and then expecting that the directors are reflexive about how their projects are rolling out, and maybe even have an iterative process embedded in the methodological design so that they can pivot to a new direction if they are finding that the systems they've established are simply creating the outcome they don't want to see. And we've seen this happen, right? We've created a method, we followed the method, we think it's good, but then we realize at the end it doesn't work. But unfortunately, sometimes we realize it halfway through and never change what we're doing because the project is supposed to move in that direction. So I think having that as part of the research process itself might go a long way in doing that. But Siobhan, to your point, I think the university is limited as an institution by its very history and its place in society.
I think you also raised another thing I was thinking about in relation to this, really, and this reflects to some of the conversations about crisis and the sort of tension between the fixed time frame of a research project and the never-ending lived reality of those crises for the people we're researching. And I guess we have a responsibility to motivate research funders to fund in different ways and not to sort of be, what's the word, transfixed with the need for new after new after new different research projects. I guess we have a responsibility to try and think through how we can generate funding and motivation for these sort of long-term research initiatives that you're talking about, because it's only within that framing that we can do this better work with the people we are researching with. And
this is actually one of my concerns about what we're doing right now. For those of us who are working COVID-19, if we're imagining that COVID-19 is a process that is going to play out in our lives for, let's just say for at least a decade, but we have a vaccine now. And if we're going to be realistic, funders at some point very, very soon are going to turn their directions elsewhere. How do we maintain that focus on the broader implications of COVID-19, the sociocultural, economic, political implications of COVID-19? How do we get the funders to focus on that? And Siobhan, I agree with you 100% on this. I don't know what the answer is, but it will require us to convince funders somehow.
Yeah. I think the question question of perpetuity of projects is especially also tricky when students graduate. You know, it's not that the stakeholders are always the same, right? So oftentimes projects need, I don't know, a relay in terms of who picks up from, you know, where it was left off. So yeah, we do have to take a group photo. So this is the last point on the agenda, unless somebody has a question before then. Um, and please feel free to unmute yourself if you do.
Just one reflection on the last thing. I think also because some of these things that are coyuntural, as we say in Spanish, so that happen in the moment, and then we worry about continuity. But what Jason has told us and what has come up in some of the talks is that there are so many structural problems that COVID is just the lens that lets you see those. So I think that we should see the continuity in those problems of, for example, you with the Anthropocene, or the idea of risk management and planning in our case. So maybe trying to refocus and say that we have a problem that we are tackling that is beyond this moment and this thing. But yeah, it's difficult to argue that, but I think we should go beyond that, and it would be possible. Yeah.
Nandini says that, yeah, I think we as oral history practitioners also think of low cost, long term work. Nandini, do you want to add to that?
Well, no, just I think that there are many practitioners who have done this part-time because it has to be long-term, you know, do some other work, keep the costs very low, very, very low. And it's possible now, you know, with the minimum travel costs, digital thing, archiving is not so costly. So we must also think of bringing down our costs and think of how long term we can do it ourselves also.
Fabulous note to end on. So I will stop the live stream and officially thank you, Jason, for everything that you said today, and just the conversation it'll generate